dioses y diosas. Atenas, Grecia. Una ciudad de floreciente comercio y cultura. Es también una ciudad de fe. La fe ortodoxa griega, parte de la gran rama oriental del cristianismo. Pero alguna vez hubo aquí otro mundo, del que solo quedan provocativos fragmentos, que nos llevan a través del tiempo, tanto sobre la tierra como debajo de ella, a un mundo que fue igualmente floreciente e igualmente devoto, el mundo de los antiguos griegos. Este, aún hoy día, se manifiesta a través de uno de sus grandes legados, la mitología griega. Está poblada de numerosos dioses y diosas, cada uno con ciertos poderes y con una historia propia. Por varios miles de años, mucho antes de la era cristiana, los relatos de los dioses y sus obras fueron pasando de una generación a otra por la tradición oral.
It is extremely hard, but one tries to fantasize of what was it like in those days. I think favorite stories of gods must have been, thinking back, what did the child think and was impressed about was, how did Zeus give birth to Athena from a headache? Apollo, who was a very wild young man, who then developed into being the god of order, of music, of art. Poseidon, who would create storms when he was angry. Athena, who was the protector of our capital city and was in favor of peace.
Presidiéndolo todo estaba Zeus, dios de los cielos y dios del trueno.
Zeus is a sky god, and you're in the domain of Zeus when you're out there in nature. Zeus had some control over whether you had a good day or a bad day, and a good life or a bad life. He had two jars on the doorsill, and there was a jar of good and a jar of evil. And to each man, Zeus would pour out a portion of good and a portion of evil.
También existían Afrodita y Artemisa, dos caras de una misma moneda.
Aphrodite. And what is she the goddess of? She is the goddess of sexuality, female sexuality. She's a goddess of beauty. She's associated with lots of fertility issues. You have Artemis on the other side. Artemis, who is this chaste virgin.
Y Apolo, quien al igual que todos los dioses y diosas de la antigua Grecia, tenía más de un poder.
He is the organizer, the civilizer. He's the one who brings roads to places where there were never roads before. He's the one who heals, but he also can bring plague. And this is something that happens in the case of many Greek gods. If they can cause something, they can also stop it.
He was a god, as heard it most brilliantly put, a god of distance, and therefore he would deal with people not face to face and hand to hand. He was better at shooting his bow and killing people from a very far off distance, and therefore his loves perhaps are best kept at a distance too.
Estos dioses y diosas evolucionaron a medida que los antiguos griegos buscaron significados y tal vez la fe en un mundo cambiante. Sus historias han sido adornadas y han cambiado a través del tiempo, a medida que distintas civilizaciones han entrado en contacto con la antigua Grecia.
Greece has been inhabited since about 70,000 BCE, and there were invasions of people from the Middle East and from the north, and each invasion led to not another set of divinities, but further layers of divinity added to the existing divinities. So Greek gods are a real amalgam of multiple cultures of the Middle East mostly.
The Greek gods were of such diversity that they are unlike many of the other gods from around the Mediterranean because they incorporated elements of a lot of different peoples around them. And they don't clearly match a lot of the other peoples, say, in Celtic or Italian religions.
Estas historias se transmitían a través de la tradición oral, pero en algún momento alrededor del 750 a.C. fueron recopiladas, organizadas y escritas. Pese a que los investigadores discuten sobre si uno o más autores estuvieron involucrados en la actividad, la creencia popular se inclina solo hacia uno: Homero.
As far as we know, the real crystallization of Greek mythology was around the time of Homer, 750 BC. And with Homer, we find the creation of Greek mythology and the creation of the gods. Homer gave the Greeks their gods. Homer was effectively the closest thing the Greeks had to a Bible.
Al principio, nos cuenta Homero, existía Océano, espíritu en forma de un gran río, circular y eterno, que fluía sobre sí mismo. También existía otra presencia, Tetis, en ocasiones llamada la primera madre. Cuando finalmente ellos se unieron, iniciaron la línea de descendencia que eventualmente daría origen a los dioses y diosas de los antiguos griegos. Unos 50 años después de Homero, el poeta Hesíodo compuso la Teogonía, en la que también describe la creación de los dioses. Pero de acuerdo con Hesíodo, el mundo se inició de manera distinta, ya que primero existió una presencia sobrenatural llamada caos, que para Hesíodo significa vacío, no desorden.
Once upon a time, there was chaos. And after chaos, there was a goddess called Gaia, Earth. And Gaia slept with, married, mated Uranos, heavens.
Urano, sin embargo, no deseaba hijos. Él se sintió amenazado por ellos y les impidió venir al mundo. Gea conspiró con Cronos, uno de sus hijos no natos, quien castró a su padre, presumiblemente desde el vientre materno. Los cercenados genitales de Urano cayeron al mar, de donde surgió un sorpresivo ente: Afrodita, diosa del amor. Estas historias dieron forma a lo que es conocido como mitología griega, derivada de la palabra griega mitos, lo que implica algo que no es cierto. Pero para los antiguos griegos, estas historias fueron un asunto de fe y ayudaron a explicar cómo el mundo funciona de la manera en que lo hace.
Interestingly, love and war, or violence and sex, are deeply connected in Greek mythology, and not only in Greek mythology, but in a number of mythologies. Why are these two things deeply connected? I think that the ancient peoples, and certainly the Greeks, felt that deeply passionate feelings were somehow connected in the human mind and in the human emotions. That is, great desires and great fears or great hatreds were somehow linked.
De esta manera, las historias y personajes de la mitología griega tienen aplicaciones en la vida real. La historia de la creación de Hesíodo continúa para contarnos cómo Cronos liberó a sus hermanos y hermanas del vientre de Gea. Estos seres llegarían a conocerse como los titanes, nacidos solo después de la castración de su padre. El tema del conflicto entre padre e hijo continuó, ahora con Cronos asesinando a sus propios hijos.
Cronos married Rhea. Every time Rhea gave birth, he'd swallow the children. Rhea desperately wanted to have some children, and so she took one baby, Zeus, when he was born, and wrapped him up and hid him in a cave in Crete to be raised, and gave Cronos a stone wrapped up in swaddling clothes that he swallowed so that he thought he was swallowing the baby. Well, Zeus grew up, came, attacked his father, and all the children emerged. And those were the beginnings of the Olympian gods.
Zeus desenterró la roca con la que su madre engañó a su padre. Esta puede ser vista incluso ahora en el sagrado santuario de Delfos.
There's always a kind of inherent conflict and tension between fathers and sons. Greece has been, really until this century, a subsistence economy. And so if you have a small farm, the father's in charge of that. The son, even the first son, is not going to get any kind of rights until the father moves on, retires or dies.
What is the concern there? There's a real concern, obviously, about issues of succession and power.
Luego de que Zeus rescató a sus hermanos y hermanas de manos de su padre, ellos tomaron el monte Olimpo. Desde esta fortaleza, lucharon por el control del mundo contra su padre, sus tíos y sus tías, que eran los titanes. Finalmente, los dioses y diosas del Olimpo triunfaron. Ellos reconocieron a Zeus, dios de los cielos, como su rey. Pero los seres humanos aún tenían que aparecer en escena. Cuando regresemos, la perturbadora y provocativa llegada de los humanos al mundo. La historia de la creación en la mitología griega sigue adelante en el relato de Hesíodo. Generaciones de dioses continuaron luchando entre sí, todo esto antes de la llegada de los humanos al cosmos.
I think it says something very interesting about a culture, whether it considers its formative moments to be ones of conflict or ones of sort of unified production, peaceful production. I am overwhelmed each time I study or teach a course that deals with Greek mythology, how persistent these conflicts are.
Luego de triunfar sobre los titanes, el gran dios Zeus se unió en matrimonio con Metis, quien era un titán y en consecuencia su tía. Eventualmente, ellos tuvieron una hija que nació totalmente desarrollada y armada de la frente de Zeus. Era Atenea, la diosa de los guerreros. Otros dioses y diosas entraron al mundo, cada uno con funciones distintas. Sin embargo, todos ellos tenían algo en común, un atributo que virtualmente los apartaba de todas las demás divinidades del mundo antiguo. Su apariencia era humana.
If you think of Egyptian religion, with its gods having animal heads, various animal bodies, or Near Eastern, Akkadian, Mesopotamian, Hittite religion, where you see divinities associated with lions and other fierce animals, the Greeks' decision to somehow represent the gods as being like Greeks is really an innovation. We're not really sure where it came from.
When you think about divinity, you're talking about the unknown. And you really can only talk about the unknown in terms of the known. In the Hebrew Bible, in Genesis, it says, God came down and he walked in the Garden of Eden in the cool of the evening. It's almost impossible to talk about divinities without doing something like that. Xenophanes said, if horses could draw, horses would draw their gods as horses.
En el relato de Homero, es solo después de que los dioses y diosas se instalan en el monte Olimpo que la historia de los seres humanos comienza a desarrollarse. El relato judeo-cristiano de la historia del mundo culmina cuando Dios crea al hombre, a quien le da el dominio sobre todas las otras criaturas de la tierra. Sin embargo, los antiguos griegos creían que la creación del hombre había sido de muy poca importancia en el cosmos.
Although the Greeks had a human-centered universe, their view of man was almost as an afterthought. He was a smaller creature in the universe, something certainly lesser than the gods. And therefore the creation of humans had to take a second or third place down the line in the Greek world of the cosmos and the Olympian deities. So why was the creation of man given such a small role in the creation of the universe?
It could be that Greeks just assume that human beings were always around, that human beings are in fact so important that there was never a stage when they didn't exist. It's still something of a mystery.
I like to think that Greek myth reflects a certain understanding by the Greeks of humans' place in the world, that humans are not the center of things, that there's a whole wealth of created world into which humans have to fit. This is a great contrast with a number of other cultures and belief systems.
Después del nacimiento de los dioses, la mitología griega cuenta distintas historias de la creación del hombre. En ninguna de ellas, los comienzos del hombre son favorables.
We lived like ants in the ground, and we couldn't read, and we didn't know the seasons, and we didn't know the weather, and we couldn't think, and we couldn't hear. We were just despicable worms and worth despising.
En la versión de Homero de la creación de los humanos, el dios Prometeo fabricó al primer hombre de arcilla y le insufló vida. En la historia de Hesíodo, Zeus creó sucesivas razas de hombres, de oro, plata, bronce y hierro. Tal parece que cada raza simbolizaba aspectos distintos de la condición humana. La primera raza era hecha de oro. Sus vidas eran fáciles y sus cosechas abundantes. Ellos literalmente se regocijaban con los dioses.
In the beginning, there was a golden age, and people lived on the earth, and all the crops grew of their own accord, and everybody was good, and everybody was just. And those people, after a while, just disappeared.
La raza de oro parecía vivir una existencia perfecta en algo similar al paraíso. Y sin embargo, esta raza se extinguió sin explicación. En la historia bíblica del paraíso, las dificultades de la vida son vistas como un resultado de la caída en desgracia de Adán y Eva en el jardín del Edén. Para la raza de oro de la mitología griega, no hay explicación para su desaparición. La razón de su destino continúa siendo un misterio.
The Greek system, in which humans and their creation are not really a topic of concern, is so different from what you find in Genesis, where we have this focus on the creation of the first man. Of course, in Genesis, it's related to the further story, what happened after the first man and woman disobeyed God. In Greek myth, disobeying the gods is not such a big deal as it is in Genesis.
So why doesn't Hesiod have an answer, or why doesn't Hesiod give an answer to why the Golden Age race came to an end with the Judeo-Christian myth of the fall from the Garden of Eden? Because that clearly was the fault of Adam and Eve. And what that means is there is no really good explanation for why the world is so difficult now, why humans can't have an easy time.
Después de que la raza de oro se extinguió, Zeus fabricó hombres de plata. Pero esta raza no evolucionó por completo.
The Silver Age people were babies forever, and then they had this short period of maturity, and then they had a horrible old age. And they disappeared under the earth. They were more arrogant and did not worship the gods sufficiently.
A continuación, vinieron los hombres de bronce, quienes se exterminaron a sí mismos a través de guerras constantes. Finalmente, la raza de hombres que aún vive hoy en día es, aparentemente, la de los hombres de hierro.
So basically, this story of degeneration has moved to the present age, where actually it shows a balance in these various views of the important things in life for the Greeks, namely your attitudes to the gods and your attitudes towards warfare and fighting for your city-state, and how you can get along or not get along with each other.
Curiosamente, todas estas historias hablan de la creación de solo la mitad de la raza humana, el hombre. La mujer fue creada como una aflicción, como castigo, y todo a causa de un truco.
The first woman was sent to the earth as a punishment to mankind. This sounds incredibly misogynistic, and it was an incredibly misogynistic story on the part of Hesiod, who told this in 700 BC. But the story goes that one of the gods, Prometheus, tried to trick the master and king of all the cosmos, Zeus.
Prometheus is a trickster god. He's a smart god. Prometheus means forethought. He killed a sheep, and he took the sheep, and he took all the good, wonderful meat, and he put it inside the disgusting belly. And he took all the bare bones, and he wrapped them up in the beautiful white shining fat, which is, of course, what burns in a sacrifice. And he presented these two bundles to Zeus, and he said, "You pick."
Zeus supo que había sido engañado por Prometeo, que representa la raza humana. En venganza, Zeus castigó al hombre quitándole el fuego. Prometeo se robó el fuego y se lo devolvió a la humanidad.
And by stealing and giving men this gift of fire, he was therefore punished indirectly by having a woman created who was given to human beings. Now, Zeus didn't just sort of give this evil thing, as he thought, to mankind. He called it a beautiful evil.
She's one you can't do without. She's a kalon kakon in the terms of the Greek, a beautiful bad thing. And so Greek myth, Greek poetry likes to have it both ways. Women are beautiful. Women are something irresistible. At the same time, women make you work. And so they're a bad thing.
I do think that throughout Greek mythology, you see a repeated emphasis on the threat that women pose. The threat they pose because of your need for them, the need to have children, and the very real fear of losing control because of desire. Overwhelming feminine sexuality threatens men.
Zeus no le dio al hombre cualquier mujer. De hecho, él les dio a los hombres una kalon kikon, una hermosa maldad. Su nombre es Pandora, y ella llegó con una caja llena de males para esparcir por el mundo. Cuando regresemos, ¿por qué la esperanza está en la caja de Pandora? La primera mujer de la mitología griega es Pandora, y su historia se asemeja a la de Eva y el fruto prohibido en el jardín del Edén. A Pandora le dieron una caja y le dijeron que no la abriera, pero ella de todos modos lo hizo, soltando todos los males del mundo, todas las enfermedades, dolores, sufrimientos y penas. Demasiado tarde, ella cerró la caja dejando solo algo, la esperanza. Pero, ¿qué estaba haciendo la esperanza en la caja de Pandora llena de maldad?
Hope is there as an evil, which is, I think, fascinating. Hope is an evil because hope allows you to act with the sense that you can control the future. And in Hesiod, that is a very dangerous thing to do. You can't control the future, and it's to act under a delusion.
Is hope something good or something bad? And the Greeks loved this kind of dilemma because hope could be good, could be bad, and so it was ambiguously left back in the jar for humans to use or to avoid.
Pandora es quizás el más prominente, pero no el único ejemplo de mujeres como fuente de maldad en la mitología griega. Algunos estudiosos encuentran un significado más profundo del menosprecio de las mujeres y apuntan a Afrodita, la diosa del amor.
If you look at the myths of Aphrodite, who is the most beautiful and the most sexually desirable thing ever, men are afraid of her. She sees a man, a human being, Anchises, on a hill outside of Troy, and she wants to sleep with him. And she goes to him, and he says, "You are too beautiful to be a human. You must be a goddess, and I don't want to sleep with you." And she says, "Oh no, I'm just a maiden from the neighborhood." They go to bed together, and when he wakes up, she's become her goddess self, and he's terrified. He's terrified he's going to be emasculated, that he'll lose his strength.
En contraste, los griegos antiguos creían que Atenea, una diosa sin papel sexual, es una gran fuerza del bien.
Athena is the protector. Athena is the warrior divinity who leads the just defense war. She is the city goddess and in many respects the most important divinity the Athenians have. And that might be true for many other cities where you have an Acropolis with the Temple of Athena on top.
En consecuencia, el mundo de los dioses y las diosas griegas no es simplemente una colección de pintorescas historias, sino una ventana a una civilización antigua, a sus pensamientos y sus valores.
The kind of nonlinear thinking that you see in myths, the sort of narratives that leap all around, that introduce strange creatures, look a lot like dreams. And so the question, I think, is whether Greek myths are somehow the collective unconsciousness of Greek civilization at an early period.
Ya fuera de modo consciente o inconsciente, los dioses estaban muy presentes en la vida diaria de los antiguos griegos.
In each of the mountains, in each of the plants, in each of the emotions they felt that there was a God in control behind this.
One of the attractive and unusual things about Greek religion from the beginning is its responsiveness to environment. There are nymphs, for example, who inhabit watery places. There are nymphs of the mountains, nymphs of the trees. There's an acknowledgement that rivers are a kind of religious force. And Greek religion in this way has a certain affiliation with modern ecology, the recognition that individual places have a value, a kind of numinous quality, a sacred quality.
The Greeks had particular terms for sacred. In fact, they had several terms for sacred. One of them is hieros, and hieros means that it belongs to the gods. In fact, the Greek word for religion is ta hiera, the sacred things.
Y de ese modo, las historias en la mitología griega eran utilizadas para explicar un mundo frecuentemente difícil y azaroso. El invierno nació cuando Perséfone, la hija de la diosa Demeter, fue raptada por el dios Hades, quien la llevó al mundo subterráneo para hacerla su esposa.
Demeter was horrendously upset to have lost her daughter and began searching the world looking for her daughter. Couldn't find her daughter, wept, cried, crops didn't grow, hence the gods weren't getting sacrificed. So finally, some gods went to Zeus and said, you've got to get Persephone back so her mother makes crops grow so we get our sacrifices and all the people don't die.
Finalmente, a Perséfone se le permite regresar con su madre, pero solo con una condición. Cada año, Perséfone debe pasar 3 meses con Hades. Durante este periodo, su madre Demeter, diosa de la agricultura, queda inconsolable y en consecuencia cada año los campos son arrasados con el frío invierno. De este modo, las mayores crueldades de la vida eran explicadas. Las dificultades personales, sin embargo, eran frecuentemente explicadas por alguna ofensa contra los dioses, Aquellos que ofendían a los dioses eran castigados, no por las autoridades terrenales, sino por las propias divinidades.
There's a Greek word, in fact, deisidaimonia, which means fear of the gods or respect for the gods. And this was a positive thing. Life was felt to be fairly precarious, and you needed to do everything you could to get whatever powers ruled the world on your side to keep safe. Many of them lived one drought away from starvation, and you just didn't mess around with the world like that.
One of the things I love about Greek myth is it never lets people off the hook. It never says, this happened because the gods made it happen. It's our fault if we can just understand why. It's sort of I think, a difficult world to exist in.
En un mundo lleno de dificultades, la gente frecuentemente busca un héroe, alguien que traiga redención a una vida frecuentemente golpeada por la adversidad. Algunos creen que un niño nacido de un dios griego y una mujer terrenal presagia la aparición de Cristo. ¿Estaba esto destinado a suceder? Cuando regresemos, dos de las más grandes figuras de la mitología griega y cómo iluminaron el pensamiento de los griegos antiguos con el debate entre destino y libre albedrío. Una de las más famosas figuras en la mitología griega puede posiblemente haber ayudado a marcar el camino para un suceso posterior, trascendental en la historia de la humanidad. Heracles, mejor conocido como Hércules, nació porque el gran dios Zeus se prendó de una bella mortal. Ella, sin embargo, era una fiel esposa. Zeus tomó la forma del esposo de ella y así logró poseerla. El estupor aumentó por el hecho de que Zeus estaba casado con una de sus propias hermanas, Hera.
The notion that the gods are not always ethical, not always honest, is also one that makes sense when you think about it. And the Greeks seem to have been comfortable with it for many centuries. It makes sense because if the gods are humans, but better off somehow, more strong, more powerful, immortal, they never have to take the consequences of anything they do, whereas humans do. The burden of acting ethically, of thinking about consequences, falls on human beings, not on gods.
Hera fue incapaz de descargar su ira sobre Zeus. En una acción completamente característica de los dioses griegos, ella enfocó su rabia en el niño nacido de la infidelidad de su esposo. Heracles fue tal vez el héroe griego más famoso y una de las figuras más importantes de la mitología griega. Incluso en su infancia, Heracles fue dotado de una extraordinaria fuerza. Hera envió serpientes mortales a su cuna y Heracles las estranguló a ambas.
Many of the Greek heroes did in fact have one divine parent and one mortal parent. More generally, a hero was a man of more than normal strength, who was somehow marked out for a life of achievement, but also a life of enormous difficulty. They were very difficult to integrate into society precisely because of their great capacities.
La vengativa Hera continuó persiguiendo al hijo ilegítimo de su esposo durante toda la vida, provocándole periódicamente ataques de ira y locura. Profundamente arrepentido de los asesinatos y otros crímenes cometidos durante estos ataques, Heracles toma grandes responsabilidades como penitencia, que frecuentemente es el asesinato de tiranos y monstruos. Al final de su vida, a Heracles se le concede la inmortalidad y es llevado por su padre, Zeus, a vivir con él en el monte Olimpo. De esta manera, la historia de Heracles pudo haber abierto el camino para el apóstol Pablo, quien trajo la palabra de una nueva fe a los griegos varios siglos más tarde.
They had a story of a son of God, Heracles, who suffered and died and then went through an apotheosis, himself went up to Olympus. And so the story of another son of God who suffered and died and went to heaven would not be all that unfamiliar. In the same way, the notion that a God could take on human form and look exactly like one of us was completely acceptable to a pagan Greek audience. And so early Christianity proceeded in Greece and struck roots in Greece quite easily.
Not quite a Christ figure, but elements of that, because it was someone who through toil and suffering and labor and loyalty achieved divinity.
A pesar de ser tan singular, Heracles es solo uno de los muchos héroes que han habitado entre los griegos. También existen Aquiles y Ulises, grandes guerreros de la guerra de Troya, y Teseo, entre cuyas glorias se cuentan el haber matado al temido Minotauro, la criatura que hacía festines con la carne de los jóvenes griegos. Pero los héroes no tenían que ser crías de los dioses, ni siquiera necesariamente heroicos en términos actuales, es decir, correr graves riesgos por el bien de otros. Para los antiguos griegos, un héroe era alguien que rompía los lazos de la vida ordinaria sin importar las consecuencias.
It's not necessary that a hero be descended from a god or a goddess. It's not necessary that a hero even do something good in life. And so achievement is more doing something extraordinary and being recognized for it. Now, the extraordinary thing that a hero could do could even be killing a number of the enemy or killing people in his own community in such a strange fashion that the gods have to be consulted. So the heroes are dangerous, unusual individuals, extraordinary but not necessarily extraordinarily good.
Heroes really are a projection of what it is to be human on a large scale. They really focus both the great potential of human beings at their best and also the vulnerabilities of humans.
Otro héroe inverosímil es Edipo, quien mató a su padre y se casó con su madre. Habiendo cumplido su terrible destino, Edipo se cegó a sí mismo en busca de la redención. Es una historia perdurable que habla del lado más oscuro de los sentimientos entre padres e hijos.
I think there definitely was a thread of Greek culture and of Greek mythology which was interested in the conflict between father and son. Obviously, Sigmund Freud saw this and picked up on it in the story of the Oedipus and the Oedipus complex. And I think there was a thread of generational conflict that the Greeks actually feared but recognized as real at the same time.
De la historia de Edipo y sus padres surge otra interrogante. ¿Está predeterminada la vida de los humanos? ¿O tiene el hombre el poder de ejercer el libre albedrío?
Oedipus is someone who, for no reason ever given, has this fate that he will kill his father and marry his mother. When Oedipus has realized that he is not the son of the king of Corinth, as he thought he was, he says, I count myself the child of chance. And by chance, he means something very random. There is no plan. By the end of the play, it's turned out that everything he has ever done has fit into a plan. And that if he is the child of chance, it's chance in the sense that closely allied to fate.
He, Oedipus, the man, made choices. When he learned he was going to kill his father and marry his mother, he fled his home, not knowing he was adopted. And of course meets his father on the road and kills him and arrives in the city and marries his mother. He chose to leave his home. He did a terrible thing, but he didn't do it trying to do evil. And fate didn't make him do it.
La cuestión del destino de una persona contra el papel de libre albedrío fue de tal importancia para los antiguos griegos que ellos personificaron el destino en la forma de 3 diosas.
When you read the poetry of Homer, it seems that it goes 2 ways. On the one hand, the Fates are a group of 3 women, Clotho, Lachesis, and Atropos. Their names mean the weaver, the allotter, and not turning back. And they weave a thread for each person's life when that person is born and determine when that person's life is going to end. On the other hand, we see in Homer's poetry that fate is a power above the gods. The gods bow to fate in several instances.
You can look at the story of Oedipus and talk about fate. Was he fated to kill his father and marry his mother? Yes. What does that mean? Does that mean he didn't have any free will? No, it doesn't mean that. It means that's what was going to happen.
The Greeks had a complicated view of how the world worked. On the one hand, the gods controlled a lot of actions of human beings or had an effect upon it. But yet, the humans also could control their own individual destinies and call a lot of the shots. So there's this funny relationship between what the gods control and what humans control. And you know what? They loved this ambiguity.
De este modo, los antiguos griegos llegaron a un acuerdo con el hecho de que no había garantías en la vida. Algunas de sus preocupaciones parecen persistentemente familiares hoy en día.
This consciousness that the Greeks have, that you cannot have too many generations on the earth at the same time, is even expressed in a myth, the myth of the beginning of the Trojan War, which says that the earth was burdened with too many people and cried out to Zeus to relieve her burden. And so Zeus invented the Trojan War to get rid of a lot of people.
Al regreso, en Dioses y Diosas, las faltas e imperfecciones de las divinidades griegas y por qué los dioses imperfectos tenían un sentido perfecto para los antiguos griegos. Las historias de los dioses y diosas de los antiguos griegos son eternas. Todavía tienen significado para nosotros. Entre las deidades había 2 grupos de adorables hermanas que moraban en el monte Olimpo, las Gracias y las Musas. Las Gracias otorgaban belleza, encanto y gratitud al mundo mortal. Las Musas tuvieron un impacto muy profundo sobre cómo desde entonces las distintas generaciones han transmitido las historias de los dioses y las sagas de una era pasada a través de la tradición oral. Desde su elevada morada, ellas descendían a la tierra para enseñar la historia, la astronomía y las artes.
Each one of the 9 muses is associated with a particular subject, usually concerning the arts and sciences. For instance, Clio, the proclaimer, is the one that is associated with epic poetry and is the muse of history. Now, the muses are very well known because we have words like museum, the seat of the muses that are in contemporary English, and of course Greek.
Greek stories are about those things that people regard as important. They wouldn't have persisted if they weren't. I mean, if stories are going to last and be retold for several thousand years, there must be something in them that has meaning for the people who hear them across generations.
La evidencia de lo divino estaba en todas partes, Para los griegos, los dioses eran tan reales como los campos que ellos labraban y las familias que levantaban.
The number of little shrines that would be all around the city, the number of dedications to gods in big sanctuaries, really does speak to a pretty strong belief in them. Life was felt to be fairly precarious, and you needed to do everything you could to get whatever powers ruled the world on your side, to keep safe.
Desde la cuna hasta la tumba, y de una estación a otra, cada fase de la vida humana estaba entrelazada con los dioses. Aunque siempre estaban presentes en la vida de los griegos antiguos, los mismos dioses no siempre eran adorados en toda la tierra. Hace 3000 años, Grecia era un conjunto de ciudades-estados independientes, vinculadas por una lengua, cultura y comercio comunes. Pero mientras que las deidades principales como Zeus, Prometeo y Demeter eran adorados en las más de 700 ciudades-estados, cada pueblo y villa rendía culto a sus propios dioses.
The landscape of Greece is just full of gods. Gods who might not even be heard of in the next village. Every little stream, every spring of fresh water, something you come to appreciate in the dusty Greek climate, has its own divinity.
The hills divided up village from village and people from people. So each village was encouraged to have its own favorite gods and its own favorite heroes. And I think that, in terms of the natural layout of the land, was very important in the formation of myth and of their religion.
Los dioses eran numerosos, al igual que sus funciones. Hermes era el protector de los rebaños de animales domésticos. Hera, la diosa del matrimonio así como de la maternidad. Eros dominaba en los asuntos del amor. Hefesto, dios del fuego y los volcanes. Poseidón gobernaba los mares. Existía Pan, mitad humano y mitad cabra. Él era reconocido como el dios de los pastores. Y estaba Artemisa, quien era protectora de la naturaleza y la juventud.
Artemis is associated with young, blooming nature, with young animals. But Artemis is also associated with the initiation of young women. So there's a continuum in Greek thinking between what happens in the natural world and what happens in what we would identify as a very different human social sphere. To Greek mythological thinking, these are all part of the same phenomenon. And that's why Artemis can be the huntress, the one who's associated with the wild, but also the one who tames young girls.
De todas las deidades que influenciaron la vida humana, Demeter fue una de las más importantes. Celebrada una vez cada 5 años, era la diosa de los granos y las cosechas.
Greeks looked at and lived with their landscape for an awfully long time and developed stories by watching nature and by living with it. And the worship of a kind of earth goddess who protected the earth and saw to the welfare of the crops and withheld the crops if people didn't behave themselves. All of that was part of the Greek view of the cycle of nature.
Sin embargo, la relación entre lo humano y lo divino no era simple. La alianza era difícil. Pese a que los dioses eran poderosos e inmortales, no estaban exentos del cuestionamiento de los humanos. Los antiguos griegos frecuentemente criticaban el comportamiento inmoral de los dioses.
They could act in excess. Each one had passions, had made mistakes, but the immortals had to respect their own boundaries. This is the main difference between gods and mortals. Gods could do anything they liked, do as they please. Mortals had to refrain from excess. Greek gods and goddesses are facets of what could become of a deadly passion. What could happen to mortals if they really step over a boundary.
Now, we might think of criticizing the gods as a kind of blasphemy, but in fact, it reinforces the notion that the gods do exist. And I think what was really being criticized were other Greeks' attitudes about the gods. Something that's very hard for us to understand is that the Greeks could play with their notions of gods.
Superiores a los humanos sobre los que ejercían dominio, los dioses eran, sin embargo, objeto de las mismas pasiones, fallas y debilidades que los mortales. Ellos conocían el amor, la desesperanza y la tragedia. Tomaban formas humanas y eran vulnerables a las heridas y a las enfermedades. Pero a diferencia de los humanos, se curaban rápidamente.
Of course, they weren't just humans, they were different from humans in many ways. They, first of all, obviously never died. Secondly, they had incredible powers of strength and knowledge. But the reason why they're in human form is that the Greeks had tremendous pride in the human form. The Greeks had such high value for the perfection of human intelligence and physicality that they could not imagine a more perfect form to attribute to the gods.
This notion that the gods are humans plus seems to have answered a very deep need in the Greeks. It's a sort of fantasy of overcoming all the weaknesses that make us humans what we are.
Los dioses también estaban sujetos a leyes similares a las que gobernaban a la humanidad. Hermes era el guardián de los viajeros. Cuando él despejó un camino asesinando al monstruo de 100 ojos llamado Argos, tuvo que enfrentar un juicio por su crimen.
Well, he's a god, but he's polluted. And so he had to stand trial. And the way the gods all cast their votes was by putting a stone at his foot, which made a stone heap, which is called a herm.
Pese a que los dioses no eran perfectos, no podían ser irrespetados.
What you did need to do was be careful not to offend the gods, not to set yourself up as the gods' equal, not to be arrogant in that way, because that was inviting disaster, not from any other humans, but from the gods themselves. There's the story of Salmoneus, who had himself driven around on a cart, banging on shields or some noise-making implement, saying that he was Zeus and trying to imitate Zeus's thunder, and he was promptly dispatched with a thunderbolt.
I think everybody believed that somebody really powerful had to be in charge of lightning, and the obvious candidate was Zeus. Zeus was a weather god, primarily. In fact, when it rained, you said, Zeus is raining. You didn't say, it's raining. And so lightning, just this powerful, strange thing that can kill you, obviously had to be under the control of someone like Zeus.
En Atenas, la gente también adoraba a un dios sin nombre, uno al que la gente se refería simplemente como el dios desconocido.
The shrine to the unknown god was probably the Athenians' way in their own religious system of covering their bets. Just in case there was a god out there that they hadn't managed to worship, a god that might do something to them, they had a shrine to the unknown god.
Los griegos racionalizaron el mundo a su alrededor. La filosofía y el pensamiento intelectual florecieron principalmente en Atenas. Era aquí donde Atenea presidía sobre la gente con noble esplendor. Diosa de la guerra y protectora de las artes, era adorada en forma de una estatua de oro, ébano y marfil en el Partenón. Se creía que su simbólica presencia haría la ciudad invencible ante un ataque. Miles de personas acudían a rendirle tributo aquí, en una de las más hermosas edificaciones jamás construidas. Pero de todos los lugares sagrados de la antigua Grecia, pocos alcanzaron el significado de un valle sembrado de árboles, de inigualable belleza y extraño poder. Era aquí donde los griegos acudían para conocer su futuro. Cuando regresemos, la fascinante historia del oráculo de Delfos. Esta es Olimpia. Hace 2500 años, una estatua de 12 metros fue erigida en este lugar. Estaba hecha de oro y marfil y fue considerada una de las 7 maravillas de la antigüedad. Dedicada a Zeus en celebración de su omnipotencia, esta antigua maravilla presidía el evento deportivo organizado más antiguo de la Tierra, los Juegos Olímpicos.
Every 4 years, the Greeks from all over the Greek world and the islands and Italy would come to Olympia to celebrate this festival.
Los Juegos se restringían solo a los hombres, incluyendo a los espectadores. Atletas desnudos competían por la corona y la gloria bajo un ardiente sol en 5 eventos: el salto largo, el lanzamiento de disco, el lanzamiento de jabalina, la lucha y la carrera corta de 180 metros. Mientras que el objetivo de los Juegos era ganar, su propósito era la adoración.
According to one scholar, David Sansone, he believed that the athletic event is an expenditure of ritual energy for the gods. And in fact, one way of showing this is that what the athletes did was sweat. And they sweat and they had dirt on them and they had olive oil on them. And after they finished competing, they cleaned off the scum from their skin using a strigil. And they actually collected the scum from the athletes, which was thought to have magical properties. And in a sense, they were reaping the product of human energy and having this as a magical potion that the gods would honor.
Esto, entonces, era Olimpia. Y hasta el presente, en todo el mundo, ganar una competencia olímpica sigue siendo un logro incomparable.
When I had the luck to win the Olympic Games and come first, my country hadn't had a first place in any Olympics for over 50 years. All this was very exciting for a young person. You know, the idea that you get onto the podium, your achievement is honored only by a medal and nothing else. You hear the national anthem of your country, you see the Greek flag going up. These things remain in your mind, and I've often said that that is the greatest feeling in my life, other than getting engaged to my wife.
Otro de los lugares importantes para los antiguos griegos era Delfos, místico y misterioso. Delfos es quizás mejor conocido como el lugar donde se encontraba un famoso oráculo. También conocido como el oráculo de Apolo, proporcionaba claves para aquellos que buscaban echar un vistazo al futuro.
The Oracle of Apollo was a priestess who was named the Pythia. People would come from all over the known world to seek the advice of this priestess for important questions, often affairs of state, political questions, and direction.
Desafortunadamente, el oráculo hablaba en un lenguaje que nadie podía entender. Sus predicciones del futuro tenían que ser traducidas por un profeta. Pero aún así, las profecías eran frecuentemente oscuras.
There's one famous ambiguous answer in which a great king asks the oracle, "Should I go to war?" And the oracle says, "If you go to war, you will destroy a great kingdom." And so the guy goes to war, and of course, his kingdom is the great one destroyed. He should have read that the right way. The oracle always gives you a kind of question in return, a puzzle, an enigma that you have to answer.
Humans are born and they grow up and they make a choice to do this and to do that. At any point in their life, they could go to Delphi and hear an oracle like, "Beware of the sea because it will kill you." And you spend your whole life avoiding the sea so that you won't get killed. Then one day you're in an aquarium and a tank bursts and you drowned in this seawater, in this saltwater aquarium, or something more sensible than that. Did fate make that happen? No, it's just the God knew the future. and could say that it was going to happen.
Delfos también era un lugar gobernado por un hijo de Zeus. Su nombre era Apolo. Además de presidir Delfos, Apolo tenía otras responsabilidades. Era el dios relacionado con la sexualidad y el amor. Irónicamente, nunca fue conocido como un gran amante.
Apollo is beautiful. He's the most beautiful male, as Aphrodite's the most beautiful female. He is the best athlete. He is a beautiful singer. He is strong and a marvelous archer. He's your perfect human being, your perfect male. And he has this sad, sad life. He falls in love over and over and over, and none of the women want him.
And he attempted to rape girls at certain occasions in his life. He's really a god, I think, of distance and rationality more than a god of love.
Quizás la más trágica de las aventuras románticas de Apolo fue su amor por Casandra, hija del rey de Troya. Como lo cuenta la mitología griega, la trágica relación entre Apolo y Casandra influyó directamente en el curso de la historia.
He falls in love with Cassandra, who's a princess in Troy, and he says, you know, I'll give you the gift of prophecy if you will sleep with me. And she says, okay, and he does, and then she rejects him, and he makes it so that no one will ever believe any of her prophecies.
En consecuencia, de acuerdo con Homero, una pelea de enamorados aparentemente insignificante más tarde desempeñó un papel fundamental en una de las batallas clásicas de la antigüedad, la Guerra de Troya.
The Greek stories of Homer told of a glorious day in which all the Greeks actually did one thing together. They did an expedition and they fought the Trojans.
De acuerdo con Homero, el conflicto se inició cuando Paris, hijo del rey de Troya, raptó a la bella hija de un rey griego. Furioso por el secuestro, el rey y su hermano congregaron a todos los líderes del mundo griego para unirse en un ataque a Troya. Por 10 largos años, mantuvieron la ciudad sitiada, pero sin beneficio. Troya era una fortaleza impenetrable. Fue entonces cuando un general griego de nombre Odiseo urdió un plan que resonaría a través de los tiempos. Él sugirió a los griegos que construyeran un enorme caballo de madera y pretendieran abandonar Troya, como si el gran caballo fuera un tributo de partida. Pero Helena, la princesa griega, que se había enamorado de su captor, conocía a su gente y sabía que era una trampa.
Helen, who went and imitated the voices of many wives of the companions of the Greeks and walked around the Trojan horse, hoping that some of them might hear the voices of their wives and really cry out. Odysseus was the one that restrained his companions from revealing themselves.
De esta manera, la tragedia aguardaba a los desprevenidos troyanos. El caballo fue conducido al interior de la ciudad amurallada. Pero a ellos se les presentó otra oportunidad cuando Casandra, la mujer troyana que rechazó los avances del dios Apolo, también intentó advertir a sus conciudadanos.
Another warning came from Cassandra, the Trojan princess. She had been given the gift of prophecy by Apollo in exchange for sleeping with him. But in the end she refused, so Apollo made sure that nobody would believe in her prophecies.
En consecuencia, el dios Apolo se vengó en Casandra, la mortal que lo rechazó. Esto fue algo muy desgraciado para los ciudadanos de Troya. Después de mucho celebrar, los troyanos se fueron a dormir. Muy tarde en la noche, bajo el manto de la oscuridad, los ejércitos griegos regresaron. Dentro de la ciudad amurallada de Troya, Odiseo y sus hombres salieron silenciosamente del vientre del caballo de madera y quitaron el cerrojo a las puertas de la ciudad. Los griegos cayeron por asalto en las puertas abiertas y arrasaron con la ciudad. Pero la venganza no hace a un mejor amante, y Apolo seguiría siendo un fracaso en asuntos del corazón. En marcado contraste con Apolo en el área del romance, se encontraba el otro dios que dominaba Delfos, Dionisio.
Dionysus, on the other hand, is a guy you'd expect to have a lot of luck with the ladies. He's a god who is a god of the vines, he's a god of wine, he's a god of vegetation, he's a god of the sea. So he's a god who's been described as a god of the fluid element, a god of fluidity. And I think that's an excellent description because he's a god who can induce madness on the individual. Your mind can turn to a fluid mush if you're under the influence of Dionysus, whether it's through drink or through some religious ecstasy.
Strong emotion is Dionysus, formal expression is Apollo. Of course, that idea, which is as well known as the division between classical and romantic, is no longer valid. Yet, the idea of relating Apollo and Dionysus was one that was quite pertinent in antiquity. During the 3 winter months at Delphi that Apollo was absent, Dionysus replaced him. Dionysus is the god of civic disorder, but also the god of imperial democracy, whereas Apollo is the god of civic order.
De este modo, como sucede frecuentemente con los dioses de la antigua Grecia, la historia tiene una moraleja. En este caso, la lección subyace en el marcado contraste entre Apolo y Dionisio.
Dionysus is a god who is worshipped by women and is worshipped in the countryside and leads women out of their homes, away from their looms, to the tops of mountains where they dance all night and carry torches, and men thought drank a lot. We think about Apollo as the god of reason, as the god of order. On his temple at Delphi, there are all these things. It says, nothing too much, Medanagon, nothing too much, moderation in all things.
Mientras que los dioses amaban, luchaban y gobernaban los cielos y la tierra, bajo los fértiles campos y el paisaje bañado de sol de la antigua Grecia, existía otro reino. Un lugar oscuro y agorero. Cuando regresemos, el aterrador destino de las almas fallecidas en la antigua Grecia, el mundo subterráneo. Cuando los griegos de la antigüedad fallecían, eran sepultados o cremados. Más allá de la muerte se encontraba el mundo subterráneo, una especie de sombría existencia donde no había conciencia después de la vida. Nadie iba al cielo. Ese era dominio exclusivo de los dioses.
After death, we have a soul, according to the Greeks, which is called psyche, which goes fluttering off like a shadow of smoke into the underworld. Now, when you get to the underworld, this place is called Hades, or it's sometimes called the house of Hades, because Hades is the god of the underworld. And there's a journey that the soul has to take.
El viaje se realizaba a través del mítico río Styx, o río del odio, con un hombre llamado Caronte que transportaba el alma.
You have to pay Charon your obols or 2 obols to get across the river, and that's why these coins were put in the mouths of the corpse upon death. When you got there, the first thing you meet is Cerberus, this 3-headed guard dog at the door to the underworld. You went by, because you were a dead man, you were allowed in. If you tried to get in as a live man, you were eaten alive by this thing.
En la historia de Homero, el Hades es un lugar desagradable y temible. Es tan sombrío que en ningún lado existe un templo dedicado a Hades. El mundo subterráneo es descrito como un lugar donde los espíritus humanos sufren una eternidad de sueños vacíos.
Hades is terrible and inexorable, but he is not the punisher of souls like Satan in Christianity. Psyche in Greek means breath, comes from a verb psychein, which is to breathe. Now, when someone dies, he no longer breathes. Psyche has really been translated as soul. Now, psyches in the underworld have no consciousness.
Había 2 niveles en el mundo subterráneo. El primero, llamado Erebo, era donde el alma pasaba directamente después de la muerte. El segundo es un lugar más profundo y terrible llamado Tártaro. Las almas violentas y sin arrepentimiento que han ofendido a los dioses son confinadas al temido Tártaro.
One of the most famous characters who was put into Tartarus was a fellow named Tantalus. And Tantalus was made to stand in a river with a fruit tree over his head. And he was eternally thirsty and eternally hungry, because whenever he reached to drink out of the river, the water would flow through his hands and he couldn't get it to his mouth. And when he reached for the fruit of the tree over his head, it would always move just out of reach. And so he was eternally tantalized, as we have the word from it now.
De esta manera, los dioses y sus historias daban un significado a los distintos ciclos de la vida e incluso a una posible vida después de la muerte. También ayudaban a los griegos a establecer una moralidad y un cuerpo de ética. En la antigua Grecia, una de las civilizaciones más avanzadas de su época, estas historias eventualmente inspiraron el nacimiento de una nueva forma de arte, el teatro. Dramaturgos más recientes como Eurípides, Sófocles y Aristófanes dramatizaron estas historias, permitiendo a los relatos épicos cobrar vida para las generaciones a través de los siglos.
The relation of literature to myth and religious belief among the Greeks is a very complicated one. You have to remember that for them, literature, poetry especially, was not the preserve of an educated elite. It was not even originally meant to be read. It was publicly performed. It was accessible to everyone.
They had various kinds of performances. They had oral poetry, choral dancing, drama, but they would never think of it as something like one category, and especially they would never think of reading this material. You had it performed. And therefore it's much more deeply embedded in the local culture. It's not something that only a few people do, read these works. It's something that everybody hears and sees.
Algunos de los primeros autores basaban sus obras y su poesía en temas que eran críticas a los dioses, algo que más tarde los filósofos condenaron de modo vehemente.
Plato's criticism of traditional literature and of the stories in them was that the gods essentially didn't act like gods. I think Plato especially was very uncomfortable with that because of his own notion of what a god ought to be. You can see some of the same critique in Euripides, in his tragedies, his sense that, gods shouldn't really act the way that a lot of the myths he's treating dramatically show them.
Certainly when you look at a drama like the Ion, in which Apollo is represented as a rapist, you begin to question the value of a god like that.
Algunos filósofos creyeron que la redención era la moraleja de la historia. Al final de la obra, la mujer que fue ultrajada se convirtió en la madre del hijo de Apolo, Ión. Él llegaría a convertirse en el líder de la ciudad-estado de Atenas. Muchas de las obras reflejaban el lado más tempestuoso de la naturaleza humana en la conducta de los dioses. La sexualidad y los asuntos del corazón eran controlados por Afrodita, la diosa de la belleza, el amor y la fertilidad. Al igual que Apolo, Afrodita vivió una vida turbulenta.
Aphrodite was connected with warfare through her union, her affair with Ares, the god of war. And they were two famous lovers. Aphrodite wasn't actually married to Ares. She was married to Hephaestus, or Vulcan, the god of the forge. But she had this flaming affair with Ares, the war god. And the question is, why are these two always getting together? It's the fury of their mutual passions which made them two gods that were beyond the control of all the other gods. And as the saying goes, that every lover is a soldier on a campaign.
En consecuencia, las primeras escrituras griegas transmitían las lecciones de la vida diaria. Sin embargo, algunas obras reflejaron una actitud flagrantemente sexista hacia las mujeres. Un ejemplo de esto fue la historia de Hipólito.
He despised women. He despised female sexuality. He was chaste, pure. We'd send him to a psychiatrist, but pure as the snow. His stepmother's nurse, handmaid, went to Hippolytus and told Hippolytus that his stepmother was in love with him. Hippolytus was appalled. He was horrified.
When Greek men got together at the drinking parties, at the symposia, we know that they told stories, that they produced poetry, which made fun of women. In early Greek culture, women were seen as consumers of men's effort. The man had to farm, the woman simply consumed the effort, stayed at home, cooked, and was always on the man's back. And there's a strong misogynistic strain in Greek literature all the way through the 5th and the 4th century.
Así, los grandes dramas y comedias se presentaron en los anfiteatros de todo el territorio, con repartos totalmente masculinos que desempeñaban el papel de los dioses y las diosas, así como de los hombres y las mujeres mortales. Pero los griegos no fueron los únicos absorbidos por las historias de deidades y héroes. Hacia Occidente, cruzando el Mediterráneo, un nuevo gran imperio estaba por nacer. Cuando regresemos, la sombra de la poderosa Roma cae sobre la antigua Grecia. Los dioses y diosas griegos, al igual que la Grecia clásica, conocerían los embates del tiempo y de los cambios. Como deidades funcionales, finalmente serían cubiertos por la niebla del tiempo. Sin embargo, no han desaparecido completamente.
Even though they're not part of our religion, we still need these stories. They're wonderful, richly suggestive tales about how the world works and what we are as human beings. Generation after generation of modern students love and are fascinated by these myths. And I think that springs from something we all have in us, which is a desire to make stories, a need to understand the world by making stories about it.
La mitología griega ha trascendido los siglos, llegando hasta nosotros no solo en la forma de grandes poetas y dramaturgos, sino a través de otras culturas. Una de las primeras fue Roma, en el extremo occidental. Esta absorbió mucho de lo que Grecia tenía que ofrecer.
The Romans discovered Greek religion really in the 3rd century BC and began to make a bigger deal of it than it had been before. We know that there had been cultural contact for a long time, but there was a kind of prestige to the Greeks that the Romans felt they didn't have. And so they took over really the Olympian system and aligned their own local gods with more recognizable high-status Greek gods.
Al adoptar a los dioses de los griegos, los romanos impregnaron el panteón de deidades con características distintivamente romanas. La primera prioridad fue asignarles nombres romanos.
Zeus became Jupiter in their terms. Ares became Mars. Athena became Minerva. And when I say became, I mean that they had these gods existing already, Minerva, Mars, Jupiter, but they now aligned them in a new way that said, yes, we're part of a continuum of culture with the higher status Greeks.
Otros dioses adoptados por los romanos incluían a Hera, quien llegaría a conocerse como Juno. A Poseidón se le dio el nombre de Neptuno. Hades reemergió como Plutón. Afrodita sería inmortalizada como la diosa Venus. Y así, el panteón griego se convirtió a gran escala en el panteón romano. Cuando la poderosa Roma se convirtió en un imperio, finalmente ocupó un desconocido y polvoriento rincón del Medio Oriente llamado Judea. Aquí, los hebreos se amontonaban alrededor de su ciudad capital, Jerusalén, donde una nueva religión estaba naciendo. Después de la crucifixión de Cristo, sus enseñanzas se extendieron rápidamente. Incluso el cristianismo encontró conexiones con las filosofías griega y romana, particularmente a través del apóstol Pablo.
We know that Paul was educated in Greco-Roman terms. He quotes Euripides at least several times in his epistles. Later on, notions that had developed in Platonism especially became crucial in the ways in which early Christians tried to make their religion more understandable to a highly educated class in the Greco-Roman world. In the Orthodox Church, even today, the Greek Christian Church, you still see some of the mysticism that you can identify in the works of Plato in the 4th century BC.
La creencia cristiana de que Jesús era el Hijo de Dios, nacido de una mujer mortal, tenía reminiscencias de los antiguos griegos.
Because Greek religion was completely comfortable with the notion of gods interacting with human women, I think it helped in the spread of Christianity at an early period that a narrative like that was at its core. And so we'll never know cause and effect, and I certainly don't want to attribute early Christianity wholly to the Greeks, but it helped that the groundwork was laid.
A pesar de la enorme cantidad de divinidades que dominaba a los griegos pocos siglos antes del nacimiento de Cristo, una nueva idea se expandió entre la gente: la noción de la existencia de un solo Dios verdadero.
The Greek world shifted towards monotheism, I would say, sometime around the 400s and 300s BC, with the advent of philosophy. And philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, who were skeptical of the Greek religion, the way it was written in mythology, but they did believe in some supreme force, some supreme, all-good, all-knowing kind of power.
Este movimiento hacia el monoteísmo en la antigua Grecia no pasó desapercibido para el apóstol Pablo. Un día en Atenas, Pablo se encontró dirigiéndose a los ciudadanos griegos desde la cima del Areópago, una colina que era lugar de reunión para un consejo de nobles.
Entonces Pablo, puesto en pie en medio del Areópago, dijo: Varones atenienses, en todo observo que sois muy religiosos, porque pasando y mirando vuestros santuarios, Hallé también un altar en el cual estaba esta inscripción: al Dios no conocido. Al que vosotros adoráis, pues, sin conocerle, es a quien yo os anuncio. El Dios que hizo el mundo y todas las cosas que en él hay, y de una sangre ha hecho todo el linaje de los hombres, para que habiten sobre toda la faz de la tierra. Hechos 17, 22, 26.
Una de las más poderosas fuerzas que dio forma al pensamiento griego fue la conciencia del pecado. Pero hace 2000 años, el concepto de pecado era muy distinto a las creencias de los primeros cristianos.
The Greek word for sin, the closest one, is a word that means to miss the mark, to err, to go wrong. Now, what does that mean? To sin, if you go too high, it means that you're stepping beyond human limitations. If you go too low, it means that you're not living up to your fulfillment. And so, for the Greeks, a sin was really not fulfilling who you are.
Pese a que está separada de nosotros por muchos siglos, la gran exhibición de dioses, diosas y héroes, de musas, destinos y gracias, desmesurados éxitos y amargas derrotas, es tan significativa actualmente como lo fue para los antiguos griegos.
The interesting thing about the Greeks at that period who venerated these gods, that they gave to the gods the attitude also of human beings. There was the fighting, there was the jealousy, there was the adultery, there was the happiness, there was the truth, there was the peace. There were all the things that were going on in everyday's life of the human beings was also associated with the gods. And I think that is part of the reason why these things have survived all these centuries in the minds of people and identified in the way the Greeks think even today.
Greek myths is a whole body of narratives. Say something very complicated about the world. They speak to a kind of optimism and a kind of pessimism at the same time. Greek myth as a whole really does tell us through a lot of exemplary stories, a lot of different things about the nature of reality, the nature of life, what's important, what we ought to care about.
One of the major lessons is that to read any of these stories, which are timeless treatments of big human questions of personal morality versus the morality of the state and laws that are imposed, and how do you negotiate these very difficult questions of the best behavior as a citizen in the state, those are addressed by Greek myths and by Greek legends. And you are left with this feeling that we don't know really what these gods are or who they are. But you know, we know there's some force out there. There's some huge force that's controlling our lives, and that we have to keep an open mind to what that force is doing. That's why the Greeks can speak across 3,000 years of history and tell us some questions, if not the answers, to some of the most perturbing eternal questions in the world.
Hubo una vez aquí otro mundo, y los dioses y diosas y la gente que vivió aquí todavía se sienten en el paisaje. Sus historias todavía viajan a través del tiempo. Mientras los humanos buscan un entendimiento más profundo de ellos mismos y su mundo, la antigua Grecia sigue viviendo.
Todos ustedes, los otros dioses de este gran lugar, garantícenme que mi alma será hermosa, y garantícenme que todas mis posesiones externas estarán en pacífica armonía con mi ser interior. Platón.